Okay, so our next speaker is Marcello Ceci. He will present a paper called Making Sense of Regulations to SBVR.
Yeah, thank you very much. This talk is a bit of a follow-up from yesterday's talk from my colleague Firas Al-Khalil. He covered, we cover another part of the process of translating regulation for machine reasoning. We will quickly review the regulatory compliance interpretation methodology, which is the methodology that we have devised to allow a seamless translation of the regulation. Then we will present two of our solutions, so Mercury, which is an extension of SBVR, and Ganesha, which is a tool which actually helps the subject matter expert in the translation. So very quickly, just this quick slide, very complicated, just to give an idea of anxiety and complication of the regulation, because we have multiple disciplines, we have multiple jurisdictions, here we have multiple activities, business activities, and here multiple sectors. And of course, regulation affect in a very mixed way all these sectors. And to make sense of this, so this is the complexity of the regulation. To make sense of this, it would be very useful to bring it here into to have some formal knowledge modeling. But there is actually this chasm here that needs to be bridged because, of course, as we have talked yesterday, the competency to understand that is different from the competency needed to understand that, and it's difficult for the two experts to communicate. So our technologies are devised as a bridge over the gap. So under the surface, we have Mercury, which is the language. And the SME does not see that. He only sees Ganesha, which is on top. It's the interface that we will see. It's very user-friendly, and the idea is exactly to hide anything logic from him. And so what we will, so this is another representation of the process, and so we have the SME as the lawyer, and the ST is the semantic technology expert. We use a Comantoso as a source of legal text, and we have deployed other solutions for the rest of the process. So we have the methodology there, Mercury and Ganesha, and Fyro is the ontology where the information ends up. What we focus on now is this part here, where yesterday we were focusing on that part. So now we're going to introduce Mercury and then go, but quite quickly so I can get to the demonstration of Ganesha. So Mercury is a language with two components, a structured natural language, which is the extension of SBVR, and that is mapped to a persistent model in XML that we call the HGML. And the H of them in SBVR, following the tradition of SBVR, capture a rule book and a vocabulary, which defines all the terms that are present in the rules. So Mercury C is an extension of a subset of SBVR. What we are going to present in the next slide is a different logical formulation for SBVR rules that we have devised because the original one is too verbose. We have considered it too verbose for an actual lawyer to manage it. So we introduced the action, condition, factors, and grammatical complements. We will see actually they match to some extent with the event, condition, action, model, but not completely, we will see. So the sample rule that we have is it is prohibited that a gun dealer sells a gun to a person who has a criminal record. So the action is the first element that we want to define. The action is the abstract verb that are contained in the sentence. So we find one, gun dealer sells gun to person, and every action corresponds to a condition that is the action as appearing in the rule. So we can see that is the condition corresponding to the action. We have a second action, person has criminal record, and that corresponds to that. We see person is in common. We will talk about this later. An action is thus abstract. We can create something called event, which follow the same pattern. This is like a pattern, and events will follow that pattern. So, for example, Dr. Jekyll's gun shop sells a Beretta with a certain number to Mr. Edward Hyde. And Mr. Edward Hyde has a certain record of an arrest. So these events, of course, they match the abstract template of the action. Now, all these actions are composed by elements. These elements are called factors. So in the whole rule, we find those factors here. It is important to notice that these are not vocabulary elements. So we are creating the concept of factor as an element present in the rule, because this is how then we can relate the action to each other. We will see how. So they present an entity as a participant in a condition inside the rule. We use them to classify actions and events, and we will see how we do it. And we have a parallelism with other ideas, other conception of factor. In particular, Kato's factors from the 90s. The function is similar. In the paper I discuss how this is similar. Of course, that is intended for case law. These can be considered factors for statutory law, of course. There is more than that. Every action has a template where we describe the complement. It's a bit like the roles, but we use complements. I'll tell you why. So, for example, in this first case, we can say that the template is subject sells object to an indirect object. And in the second, we can say the subject has object. So we chose complements and not roles, which are mostly what we talk about, because so we can define them and contain their number. Because, for example, now we have identified those 8. We have a longer list, but with this we can capture the structure without needing to add new ones, because again, that's something that we don't want to ask the subject matter expert to do. So this is HGML, so the XML, and this is how we represent the action. So here you can see how we assign the role to it. Every role corresponds to a vocabulary entry, so which is different. So that is a factor, and that instead is a vocabulary entry. And we also specify, of course, the template of the complements. So now we see how we combine all these elements together. And from the theory, we see that the general structure, the simple structure of a regulative norm is we have something, the body, A, and we have the head, B. And the head is deontically qualified. So we call it also antecedent or consequent. What we call them applicability condition and deontic condition. We will see now how we compose them. So in that sentence, in the same rule, we say that we have 2 actions. So we have gun dealer sends gun to person, and person has criminal record. So Dr. Jekyll selling the gun or Mr. Hyde with a criminal record. What is the actual forbidden action? The one that has a modality prohibited on it. So is it Dr. Jekyll or is it Mr. Hyde? The answer is quite simple, of course, because the model is simple. It is the gun dealer that must not sell a gun. The person who has a criminal record, that's just a condition for applicability. So we see that the subject is responsible. This is just to know, is relevant for us to know if the fact, if the event is relevant for the rule. That one is the actual assigned. Okay, so wrapping it all together, we can represent what we can find just with the definition in XML. We can see we have the modality, we have the deontic condition as defined earlier, and we have the applicability condition. And we have the person that is a factor in common, and this is what allows the reasoning. Because if the indirect object of the deontic condition is also the subject of the applicability condition, then the event matches the rule. So this is the abstract knowledge we have seen already in yesterday's presentation, how this is mapped to FIRO. We can see that indicating person as a common element allows us to define that when actually the conditions of the rule are met, and qualify that action as prohibited. So this is how we represent it in XML. So we have the idea of the rule, the original text, and these are the factors as I defined them. So not vocabulary entries, but occurrences in the rule. And the person, you see, it occurs twice. So we have the same position. This is the normal SBVR representation. They use the standard, the character positions. We add this, which is a link not to a vocabulary entry, but to a role ID. So we know it's the object or the subject. In this way, we know exactly in which roles, in terms of complements, these elements play, these factors play inside the rule. So, well, that's a complex example. I will not, of course, explain it, but it's just to tell you that how we can go from the legal source, we highlight the part that we want to choose, we can create a complex rule like this, and this will result in a complex scheme, but where there is actually a loop, and we can check that the elements that are in common between different actions are actually identified by the same event. So now I will go, sorry for running a bit, but I don't have much time. So I'm presenting now the demo of Ganesha, which is it's an early alpha. It was deployed 10 days ago, so be patient. But it's not, of course, doesn't have all the features, but we will now see. Okay, I will load it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of delay because the server is in Cork, so I will use some oh, sorry, that didn't work properly because I couldn't. Sorry. Okay, I can do it this way. Okay, so this is the login page. Once we log in, okay, I have to sit there. I told you it's quite slow, so I have. Once you log in, you have a choice of the rule books, which you can work on, so you can modify them. So you click on one, and you have it loaded here. Then you can open it, and you get here. Okay, here we have various sections that are marked up in a commentoso. I told you that the source is in a commentoso. So you can automatically click on a section and try to add a citation. That will be the dashboard, your workbench. So you can add it, and okay, you can see how you can also identify, of course, under the commentoso structure, you can identify the citation. So you can add a new citation, and it's added here. Then we go to create the rules. And here we can access the various citations that we chose. And we have an unmodifiable text here. This is the law, so we cannot touch it. What we can do is create new rules here. Actually, now I pick the definition. I should pick an actual obligation. Yeah, that is, I think, a permission. Yeah. So we can create a permission here, which is select an enforcement level, and we add the rule. Here we can, of course, copy and paste the text. An N, but I will add it. And then, of course, here the lawyer does his work, which means, of course, rearranging the words and the text in order to get something. But what he can to get to a rule that is logically sound for him. So if we want to define some concept, we just highlight it, and here is where we can create actual factors. When we create it, we choose that is a noun concept. We say it's general. And this gets marked up in this way. There's a visual feedback. So here we have, we can create a verb here. Actually, we can also look at existing, because I have created it already on another version. So if it's already existing, you can choose it. So you are creating a big vocabulary, actually, across the various rules. You can check that and see if it's not exactly the meaning that you intend. You will create another entry. So here, we have created this, and we can save the rule when we have marked up everything, and this rule gets added here. What we can then do is I click here, with working on the vocabulary itself, because that was just creating it. Yeah. So here you can specify more. This is, of course, it's working, but not completely. We are still implementing it. Here we will be able to define things like the grammatical complements and how the verb is composed. Now, the last function I wanted to show you, I will skip there. So going back to the menu, you will be able to get to a view mode. In the view mode, you can pick it's here. You can pick the various acts, and you can check what is in there. So I click on Act 1, for example, and you get a word cloud of the vocabulary terms. This is not two numbers, but this is another list of vocabulary. These are the metadata from a commentoso, and this again a mock-up. You can look at the vocabulary, where we have this list. And once we list, we can, of course, look at some kind of cards that describe the basic information. Again, this has to be completed. Throughout this process, what I guess you noticed, is that there is no, there is no, the lawyer doesn't get to see anything of the underlying logics that we have seen lately, and so we shouldn't scare him too much. So just 10 seconds for what we are going to do in the future. Create the operators and functions with mapping up keywords, testing adding features of Ganesha, and using the main capabilities, testing the capabilities of querying and classification. And from a pure research point of view, we want to go beyond the breach, represent sanction, counter-utility obligation, the rule application, and also actually support a reasoning layer, which means, of course, implementing rule. And that's why we're here. Thank you very much.
Any questions from the audience? Oh.
You mentioned it's a subset of SBVR and standard extension. So can you pinpoint the boundary line between your extensions to SBVR and proper SBVR? Because some people may want to use the tool as just an SBVR, because they need to stick to your subset.
Yeah. What we have added is the grammatical complements. And something called context that we have not described because it's mainly related to constitutive rules and legal definition. So we can allow for automatic detection of the definition depending on which law we are talking about. So these are the main additions that we have, and without them, it's not, of course, some of the legal features and the legal precision is lost. Apart from this, the rest is, also even the graphically, it still resembles SBVR closely.
Can I just add one comment?
Sorry, first, maybe Richard. Oh.
You want to add on?
Yeah, just a small
That's
comment on SBVR and the serialization of SBVR into XML. SBVR uses XMI to serialize the objects. We're not using XMI. It's too much of an overhead for a very small team for the time being. So we are preferring to work with our own proprietary XML. So we can't interoperate with SBVR directly now at the time being. So that's.
I was, what you were doing reminded me of things that they did in intelligence applications and looking for anomalous events. So, like when they were looking at September 11th, there was an anomaly in someone who takes flying lessons but shows no interest in landing. And this was very similar to your rule about buying a gun from with a criminal record. So I was wondering, could you also apply this to, like, I guess you could also apply this to intelligence applications, looking for anomalous events that might
Yeah, well, actually, investigating further the vocabulary, actually, so what defining, so you have a special view for the vocabulary, so that's where the lawyer can define exactly what is a criminal record, what is a person, or eventually there was another way. You can also rewrite the rule saying it's forbidden to sell a gun to a criminal. Like, what is a criminal then? So defining it, the lawyer can, of course, having to do it explicitly, can come down to giving parameters, and it can, of course, this can trigger also when facts that would not be recognized or would be classified like that as their own. So it can reclassify concepts under vocabularies, because we use definitions also in SBVR. So the definitions are in this logical structure anyway. So a criminal is a person who has a criminal record. So eventually there can emerge information that was under the surface. In the financial industry, they call these black swans. So it's like the unexpected event that destroy, like, ruins the work, or that really, that changes a scenario that cannot be predicted because there was none before. So it's a first occurrence. But one of the purposes is exactly to go so deep into the vocabulary to be able to detect that.
Any other questions from the audience? I've got a question for you. Not trying to be like a difficult person or something, but can you point to one use case, because you said it's a subset of SBVR and you extended that subset, and currently it's quite alive. So can you point to one scenario that your language allows you to better represent, or represent to begin with, that SBVR is not good at or cannot do at all?
The scenario, well, in comparison to SBVR, the addition of context, for example, allow to define the same term under different laws. So and that's very important for banks, because if you have a systemically relevant bank, or a systematic internalizer, or a suspicious transaction, these things are defined differently in every law we have seen in the first slide. So, and the bank works across them. So you have to work with suspicion transaction in US and in Europe, and the same transaction must be analyzed under this. So it's important to add the context. Yeah, the context allows us to distinguish that automatically. Because if we are in that law, then we will use that definition and not another. Right. As a general scenario, this is meant to work with a lot of data and with a lot of regulation. So it's a long process. Financial companies have lawyers, internal law office that work all day, but what they produce is textual guidelines. And of course you can imagine how this work is also lost. When a new regulation comes, there is another piece of paper. If they build this, they will increase. And so after a new law comes, actually another thing I haven't covered, but that a Commentoso allows to do, is regulatory change management. So of course, as these lawyers model and translate different versions of the law, they get all preserved across time, and querying, it will be able to query, depending on when the event occurred, you will apply the regulation, and so the rules. So
yeah.
That comes from that.
That's from the Ganesha system, right? Like this cool feature. Technically, that SBVR could also do that.
Well,
like
the regulatory change management with SBVR, yeah, well, you have to link, of course, you have the link to the source.
Again, I'm trying to be a bit difficult.
No, SBVR has a link to the source, but we have the Commentoso standard, so we can actually, using that, we can do regulatory change management in this way. We could, SBVR could be attached to another source management system.
Yeah, that's just my point. That makes sense. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Thanks, speaker again.